His hands were raw, not blistered, raw, torn open by chains, shredded by the oil mill. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a thief. His only crime was a dream, freedom. His punishment, Kala Pani. They call it the Black Waters, a place whispered about in fear, where men vanished and freedom itself was chained to stone. To cross these waters was to lose your name, your faith, your very self. Yet thousands of India's bravest were sent here, condemned not for crimes, but for courage. And it leaves us with a question that still echoes today. What would you do if your only crime was the dream of being free? The year was the late 19th century. The British Raj was tightening its grip over India, and rebellion was rising across the land. When ordinary prisons could no longer contain the tide of revolutionaries, the empire turned to exile. Far across the Bay of Bengal, in the remote Andaman Islands, they built a fortress unlike any other, the Cellular Jail. Locals called it Kala Pani, the Black Waters. For the British, it was a perfect weapon. Far enough to silence voices, brutal enough to break spirits. Prisoners arrived in chains, ferried across endless seas, knowing they would never return. What awaited them was not just imprisonment, but the slow erasure of their humanity. One of them, barely 20, barely alive, had once shouted for freedom. Now, he couldn't whisper for water. His lips were cracked. His tongue was swollen. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His cell, a stone coffin no larger than the cupboard, stank of blood, vomit, and rot. Iron shackles chewed into his ankles. His spine arched in agony from turning the oil mill all day, a mill meant for animals, not men. He collapsed once. Just once. For that, they beat him until his ribs snapped like sticks and pierced his lungs. There was no trial, no sentence, just exile, a one-way ticket across the sea to a prison so feared, even hardened rebels wept at its name. Kala Pani, a fortress built on isolation, pain, and silence, a machine designed not to kill, but to erase. At night, when the footsteps echoed down the corridor, when the keys scraped the locks, he wasn't sure if it was death or something worse. Because here at the edge of the world, surrounded by jungle, sea and stone, death was often mercy. This was not just a prison. This was a graveyard for the living. And yet, this wasn't the worst that happened at Kala Pani. The story of Kala Pani didn't begin with blood. It began with fear, British fear. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a nationwide uprising that nearly shattered British control, the colonizers realized something terrifying. They could not control India through law alone. They needed fear. They needed silence. They needed a place where hope could be chained to a wall and left to rot. And so they looked east to the edge of nowhere, the Andaman Islands, surrounded by black, shark-infested waters, isolated from the mainland by over 1,000 kilometers of sea, a place already whispered about in Indian culture. Kala Pani, or Blackwater, had long been feared by Hindus and Muslims alike. To cross it was to lose one's caste, one's identity, one's connection to the sacred land of India. It was perfect. In 1858, just 1 year after the rebellion, the British began their work. They didn't just build a prison. They built a message carved in stone. By 1906, the structure was complete. The Cellular Jail, a star-shaped fortress of pain. 7 wings radiated like the arms of a spider, each filled with hundreds of tiny cells, each cell built for one man, so no prisoner could speak or even scream to another. The design was no accident. It was a machine, engineered to isolate, crush, and erase. But Kala Pani was more than concrete and steel. It was a psychological weapon. Here, prisoners were not referred to by name, but by number. Their crimes weren't murder or theft, but sedition, speaking, writing, or dreaming of freedom. And the punishment was exile, silence, and slow destruction. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing a generation of thinkers, poets, fighters, and believers by dumping them into the ocean and pretending they had never existed. The British called it a penitentiary. The prisoners called it hell without fire. And for thousands of freedom fighters, Kala Pani was the last place they'd ever see. But the true horror hadn't even begun yet. That started the moment the boat landed and the prison gates slammed shut. The ship rocked gently in the water. But for the prisoners shackled in its belly, the calm sea felt like a coffin lowering into the earth. When the convicts arrived at the Andaman Islands, they were not welcomed. They were herded, stripped of clothing, names, and dignity. British officers barked orders. Native guards followed with whips. They stepped onto burning sands, surrounded by thick, suffocating jungle and a vast, endless ocean. Behind them, India. Ahead of them, the Cellular Jail, a massive black fortress rising from the jungle like a wound carved into the earth. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like it had been designed by someone who hated people. Each prisoner was assigned a number. Names were forbidden. Speaking was forbidden. Writing was forbidden. The goal was simple. Erase the man, keep the body. The jail was engineered for silence. Its 7 wings stretched out like the spokes of a wheel. Each of the nearly 700 cells was built from thick stone, windowless, and soundproof. Prisoners could not see one another, could not hear one another. Solitary confinement wasn't punishment. It was a default. 1 cell, 1 man, 23 hours a day. No light, no voice, no hope. Their only company? Rats, insects. Sometimes, the ghostly groans of other prisoners echoing faintly through the corridors, just enough to remind them they weren't truly alone, only forgotten. Meals were dumped through a slot, half-rotten rice, watery dal, stale bread, no cutlery, no dignity. If you asked for more, you got beaten. If you refused to eat, you got force-fed, sometimes with metal tubes shoved down your throat. The prison had no interest in rehabilitation, only degradation. They weren't allowed to sit during the day. Sitting was idleness, punishable by flogging. They stood all day until their legs trembled and gave out. Bathing? Once every 2 weeks. Maybe. The water was brown. The soap was sand. Their clothes, rarely changed, grew stiff with sweat, blood, and mildew. There were no beds, just the floor. There was no night, just darkness. There was no calendar, just a slow erasure memory. And if you disobeyed, if you resisted, if your spirit dared to flicker, then came the oil mill. It was there under blazing sun that men were turned into beasts and sometimes into corpses. There were no machines in the early days of Kala Pani, at least not the kind with gears and smoke. The most important machines were human, broken, starving, sunburnt men yoked to iron grinders, forced to crush coconut or mustard seeds into oil for hours every single day. This was a dreaded kohu, a heavy iron mill normally pulled by oxen. But at Kala Pani, men became the oxen, stripped to the waist, bones protruding. They were tethered to the massive grinder and ordered to walk in circles, hour after hour, step after brutal step. The tropical sun above was merciless. The stone beneath their feet blistered their soles. Their chains clanged with each rotation, a steady rhythm of despair. If you slowed down, even for a moment, the punishment came fast. A whip across the back, a lash to the face, or worse, a weakened standing cell, a tiny space too narrow to sit, too short to stand straight. Some prisoners collapsed mid-turn. Their legs gave out. Their bodies slumped under the grinding weight. But they weren't given rest. They were dragged, kicked, and forced up again. Others dropped dead where they stood. The coal hood didn't stop. It kept grinding, both seed and souls. And what was all this oil for? It was not for food, not for the prisoners. It was for British profits, exported for commercial gain, or used for lighting the homes of the same colonizers who had ordered their imprisonment. One prisoner described it like this: "My shoulders were torn, my feet bloodied. I prayed for death. But even death was denied. The brutality of the oil mill wasn't an accident. It was policy. It served a message. If you resist the empire, we will reduce you to bone and blood." And yet, men still resisted. Some would intentionally injure themselves just to avoid the mill, smashing their own hands with stones. Others attempted suicide, swallowing nails, glass, or mud. A few went mad, babbling into the darkness of their cells, smearing feces on the walls, clawing at their own faces. Even then, the mill turned. Even then, the whips cracked. Even then, the British records called it labor reform. But the prisoners knew better. The oil mill was Kala Pani's true engine, the center of its violence, the heart of its hatred. And those who dared to speak against it, they vanished into darker places. Because for some, the greatest torture wasn't the pain. It was being forgotten in a place where even the walls seemed to whisper madness. Kala Pani didn't need gallows or firing squads to kill. It had other tools, slower, quieter, crueler. Disease, isolation, madness. The prison was carved out of jungle, surrounded by stagnant water, thick mosquito clouds, and suffocating humidity. The air itself was a breeding ground for death. Inside the cells, conditions were even worse. Dysentery swept through the prison like wildfire. Malaria festered in the blood of the half-dead. Tuberculosis choked prisoners slowly, day by day, cough by blood-soaked cough. There were no doctors, no medicine, no effort to save the sick, only to quarantine them in the darkest cells, where they would rot in silence. Those who didn't fall to disease often fell to despair. Solitary confinement broke the mind. In total darkness for weeks, sometimes months, men began to hallucinate. They heard whispers in the walls. They saw figures that weren't there. They forgot their own names. Some screamed through the night, begging for someone, anyone, to talk to them. Others went mute, never speaking again, as if the silence had become their only language. And then there were those who tried to escape the only way they could, by ending their own lives. They swallowed cloth, poisoned themselves with insects, tried to hang from ceiling grates. Some smashed their skulls against the stone walls. Others bit off their own tongues, hoping to bleed out before the guards noticed. But even in death, there was no dignity. The bodies were dragged out, tossed into pits. No names, no records, just bones added to the island. And all the while, the British officers kept their ledgers tidy. No mention of torture, no word of suicide, only notes like inmate deceased natural causes. But there was nothing natural about it. Kala Pani didn't just house disease. It created it. A perfect storm of filth, neglect, and psychological annihilation. Prisoners who survived disease and madness often emerged physically broken and spiritually empty, their eyes hollow, their backs twisted, their souls unreachable. They no longer prayed. They no longer wept. They simply waited. But waiting was not the end. For many, Kala Pani had one more punishment, a deeper wound, erasing their very identity. What Kala Pani couldn't break with chains, it tried to destroy with silence. For the British, it wasn't enough to imprison the body. They wanted to obliterate the soul. And that meant going after what made these men Indian. Language, religion, culture, memory. All of it had to be scrubbed away, one layer at a time. Prisoners were banned from speaking in their native tongues. Bengali, Tamil, Urdu, Hindi, all forbidden. Orders were barked in English. Obedience was expected without translation. And if you failed to understand, the whip taught you quickly. Religious practices were mocked or deliberately disrupted. Hindu and Muslim prisoners were fed from the same filthy communal pot. Not as an act of unity, but humiliation. Pork mixed with beef. Ritual purity destroyed. The message was clear. Your God has no power here. Letters were censored or never delivered. Many prisoners had no idea if their families were alive or dead. Some never received a single word from the mainland for years. Others sent dozens of letters and got silence in return. That silence was by design. There were no newspapers, no books, no news. Time became meaningless. Days bled into nights. Seasons passed without notice. Some prisoners forgot what year it was. Some forgot the face of their own mother. And when new inmates arrived, the older ones didn't greet them, not because they didn't want to, but because they no longer knew how. One former inmate wrote, "I forgot the names of colors. I forgot what laughter sounded like. I forgot how to be a human being." Kala Pani was not just a prison. It was a factory for manufacturing ghosts, living men, emptied of everything but breath. Even education was weaponized. Some prisoners were forced to learn British poems and recite colonial odes, not to be enlightened, but to be mocked, to be reminded that even in chains, they belonged to the crown. And those who resisted this erasure, who held on to their language, their faith, their fire, they were labeled unmanageable and sent to where all troublemakers eventually went, the noose room, the place of final silence, where names were erased and bodies vanished without a word. Some prisoners at Kala Pani died slow. Some were broken by disease. Some lost their minds. But others were simply taken and never seen again. They were the incorrigibles, the ones who refused a break, who defied the guards, who dared to whisper about revolution, even from the darkest cells. The British had a solution for men like these. The gallows. There were no courtrooms, no lawyers, no public trials, only quiet conversations between officers and silent decisions scribbled in ink. One morning, a prisoner would be taken, sometimes with a cloth over his head, sometimes without shoes, sometimes without even knowing what was happening until he saw the rope. The execution chamber was hidden, a small room, cold and damp, with a wooden platform and a trapdoor. 3 men could be hanged at once. Efficient, mechanical, clean, no final speeches, no last rites. The guards didn't record names, only numbers. Inmate number 284 executed. Inmate number 392 disposed. The bodies were not returned to families. They were not buried with honor. They were taken into the jungle and left. Some say they were buried in shallow, unmarked graves behind the prison walls. Others whisper that they were dumped into the sea, claimed by the very black waters that brought them here. There are no memorials for these men, no gravestones, no names carved in stone, just memories, passed down in secret, whispered in prison memoirs, half remembered by descendants who never got to say goodbye. Even today, old locals near the jail claim they can hear footsteps at night, chains rattling, voices crying softly behind the walls, ghosts that were never given peace. The British believed they had erased them, but history has teeth, and memory, once awoken, can rise from even the deepest grave, because what the Empire forgot, the survivors would remember, and they would use those memories to strike back. They thought Kala Pani would kill resistance. They thought fear, silence, and steel bars would be enough. They were wrong. Even within the belly of this hell, flames still flickered. Some prisoners refused to die slowly. They refused to let Kala Pani erase them. Instead, they plotted, whispered, waited. In 1933, the silence shattered. The hunger strike began. Dozens of political prisoners, revolutionaries, students, poets, and patriots stopped eating. They refused to work. They refused to obey. They turned their broken bodies into weapons. Their demands were simple. Stop the torture. Treat them as political prisoners. Let the world know what Kala Pani had become. But the British response was brutal. They force-fed the strikers, inserting thick rubber tubes through their noses and into their stomachs. Many choked. Some bled. One man, Mahavir Singh, died from the force feeding. He drowned in milk and brutality. Another, Mohit Moitra, collapsed with a torn intestine. A third, Muktinath Banerjee, never walked again. But the strike worked. Word spread. Indian newspapers picked up the story. Politicians raised their voices. Suddenly, Kala Pani wasn't just a hidden graveyard. It was a scandal. The British were forced to make changes. Torture was reduced. Prisoners were grouped. Political inmates got limited rights. A tiny victory, but a crack in the fortress. And most importantly, memory survived. These men didn't just endure Kala Pani. They wrote about it. They carried its horrors back to the mainland. They told the world what the Empire tried to hide. The rebellion wasn't loud. It wasn't with guns or bombs. It was in the refusal to disappear. Even as bones broke and names were erased, these men clung to their cause. And because of them, Kala Pani could no longer hide behind its black waters. But even after the chains rusted and the empire fell, the scars of Kala Pani refused to fade. When India won independence in 1947, the gates of Kala Pani finally creaked open, but not with celebration. There was no parade, no joyful release. only silence. Many prisoners had already died. Others were too broken to speak, their minds shattered, their bodies bent from decades of abuse. And some simply disappeared, never returning home. But the island remained, and so did the scars. The cellular jail stood like a haunted monument. 7 arms stretched like a dead spider across the jungle. It was no longer a prison, but a memory and a question. What do you do with a place built for suffering? For years, the Indian government debated demolishing it. Too painful, some said. Too shameful, others argued. But then the survivors spoke. The few who lived to see freedom demanded that Kala Pani be preserved, not as punishment, but as proof. They wanted people to remember, not the stone walls or the rusted bars, but the voices that had once been caged within them. Today, only 3 of the original 7 wings still stand. The rest were torn down. But those remaining wings have been turned into a national memorial. Visitors now walk the same halls where prisoners once bled. They peer into cells no bigger than closets. They read the names of the dead, etched in marble, names the British tried to erase. The light and sound show plays each evening, casting shadows across the walls while narrators retell the horrors endured inside. Families come to honor ancestors. Children come to learn. And yet something still lingers. The air is heavy. The silence feels unnatural. Some say the walls still remember. Some say the chains still echo. Because Kala Pani was never just a prison. It was a warning of what happens when power fears freedom, when cruelty is wrapped in law, when silence is used as a weapon. The British may have built the jail, but it was the Indian spirit, broken, bloodied, and unbowed, that gave it meaning. Today, the Cellular Jail is more than a tourist site. It's a tomb for the forgotten, a shrine to resistance, a dark mirror of the empire. And as you walk its halls, one question whispers from every stone. What would you do if your only crime was a dream of being free? The chains may have rusted. The empire may have fallen. But the story of Kala Pani will never stop echoing.